Hello, everyone. I'm Crystal Trotter. I chose to examine the rhetoric of Presidents George W. Bush and President Barack Obama. My research question is, to what extent does presidential rhetoric shape foreign policy? This study is important because specific characteristics and language used in speeches define presidents' intent on specific issues and how they attempt to persuade the American public. There's also a separate language between conservatives and liberals. Conservatives tend to use words like we, our, us, terrorist, punishment, God, illegal, and American, whereas liberals tend to use language such as I, me, mine, humanity, peace, compassion, and flag. I find this type of research interesting because a lot of policy areas do not focus on specific language and meaning, especially in speeches given and how they relate to what the public views a policy to be. It is also helpful in understanding how policies are effective and what their outcomes will be. There is abundance of presidential rhetoric research that involves increasing the public's approval. There is an overabundance of literature focusing on the influences and strategies of president to increase public approval ratings. However, Zdarsky examines the complexity of presidential rhetoric. He argues that rhetoric is not only an alleged cause of shifts in audience attitudes, but it reflects a president's values and worldviews. He argues that to truly understand presidential rhetoric speeches, you must examine the framing, phrasing, organization, style, and evidence of specific presidential speeches. There are three types of rhetorical relationships: message and audiences, rhetoric and text, and the definition of literary content. The message and audience relationship is empirical. For example, to examine a message and audience relationship, one would examine if public opinion changed or support for a specific policy area increases or decreases after the speech is given. The second step is to determine the relationship between the speaker and the message. One must determine who wrote the speech and the specific words chosen to stress the intended message. Lastly, the meanings of specific words chosen must be defined, or determine what the open-end definition the speechwriter chose for a specific term. For example, President Roosevelt transformed the political landscape for a half a century by defining the new as a means to achieve the old. Lim examines the changes in substance of rhetoric that have accompanied this alleged institutional transformation. Lim looks at presidential rhetoric beginning with President George Washington and ending with President Bill Clinton. The author finds 5 changes of presidential rhetoric in the 20th century. The first major change is the State of the Union address is more anti-intellectual. Presidents make fewer references to analytical and evaluated processes and substitutes formal language for simpler terms. The second major change are speeches are more abstract. Presidential speeches contain more poetic, religious, and idealistic terminology. However, presidents have always used abstract language, including in the United States Constitution. There is a major increase in the uses of the 20th and 21st centuries. The third change is an increase in assertive rhetoric. Speeches have become more activist, presidents adopt a realist preoccupation with the language of power and are very confident. The fourth major change is presidential rhetoric speeches have become more democratic. Presidents enthusiastically are people oriented, they are compassionate and inclusive. Lastly, presidential speeches have become more conversational. It uses a language that engenders an intimacy between the president and his audience. They focus on trustworthiness and they are highly anecdotal. There are multiple strategies presidents use when trying to get a message across to the public or to increase their approval ratings. Baum examines why presidents choose to keep foreign policy out of the public view. He finds that public scrutiny disproportionately raises the potential for political prices, especially if there is a bad outcome. And he finds that the leader's efforts to generate audience costs can sometimes backfire as a reaction of the domestic audience, once engaged, are not predictable. And when national security interests in a crisis are modest, presidents are more likely to speak publicly about political adversaries unless they are quite confident of success if a fight occurs. Brace and Hickney evaluate presidential activity in public relations. They find a small amount of evidence that presidents act strategically and reactively in selecting public activities. The only major addresses show a significant positive effect. They make choices specifically when their approval ratings are low, and the majority of the strategic choices that a president makes is during his election and campaign years, especially when they are his re-election year. There's also a wide range of how presidents attempt to influence public approval ratings. Ragsdale kind of fits in the strategy and influence categories. However, Ragsdale examines the impact of the major primetime addresses of individual presidents from Johnson through Reagan, specifically on the attitudes of party and income groups within the public from 1965 to 1983. Ragsdale hypothesizes that a president will improve popularity through supporters and through critics. The second hypothesis is that president improves standing with one group at the expense of another. And lastly, a president leaves the groups who are not already supporters. Ragsdale finds that presidents, with the exception of Nixon, when it comes to military involvement, achieves inclusive nonpartisan approval gains by delivering a major national address. Ragsdale also finds that studies of presidential rhetoric show that even when discussing specific policy matters, presidents develop a symbolic identification between them and the nation. Cohen and Hammond examine whether presidential speeches can affect public expectations of the economy. They argue that foreign policy speeches have a stronger impact on the public's future orientations, and that other types of speeches, in particular economic and domestic policy speeches, do not hold as much weight. The popularity of the president is very important at the time the speech is given. Cohen and Hammond hypothesized that the popular presidents will be more persuasive. They find that different circumstances affect the president's leadership image. Foreign policy speeches tend to be the best for increasing a president's leadership image, and they demonstrate they are aware and on top of the issues. Lastly, Cohen argues the more attention a president draws in the State of the Union address, the public becomes more concerned with those issues. Cohen finds that the more presidential attention to a specific policy area, the more the public is concerned with those policy areas. Presidents do not have to use substantive arguments to sway public opinion. Popular presidents have more influence than unpopular presidents, but focus usually changes within a year, with the exception of foreign policy speeches. And then beyond foreign policy, popular presidents have no more effect than an unpopular one. Foreign policy always makes the agenda. With my theory based on Cohen's argument that foreign policy is the strongest increase of a president's popularity, I chose to do a word analysis using only foreign relations speeches, with the exception of 2 State of the Union addresses it was actually particularly the President Bush and President Obama's very first State of the Union address and the very last State of the Union address. This was mainly because I wanted to see if there was any rhetorical change within those. I did not find any rhetorical change between their first and last State of the Union addresses. For President Bush's word analysis, I'll go back to the beginning of the presentation when I gave you the conservative and liberal words. President Bush's word analysis produced a numerous amount of conservative terms, which is not surprising. However, President Bush used will 237 times. American was 125 times. People was 120. And terrorist was 106. The most interesting finding I see in this word analysis is the fact that both presidents use the same word the most. The other surprising thing I found was the fact that President Obama only said will 170 times, and President Bush said it 270. However, President Bush's speeches tend to be a lot shorter than President Obama's speeches. And there is a highly mix of conservative-based words in President Obama's word analysis. However, the main importance of this type of study is that it can be used not only for public approval ratings, but it can actually be applied to specific legislation. Foreign policy is a little stronger area for it, but I think it would pay off in the end. It would provide a better understanding of outcomes and effects of specific policy areas. It also provides a line for us to study legislators at all levels of government. Thank you.